John Keats was an English poet writing in the early 19th century. He was one of 6 children and sadly one of the first of them to die. He was only 25 years old when he died of tuberculosis. Who knows what he might have written if he had lived longer. When he found out that he'd got TB, which he'd picked up from nursing his brother Tom, he was in despair. You would be anyway, but Keats felt that he'd only just made a breakthrough in his writing. He thought that he'd finally really found his voice, and he was full of things that he wanted to say and things that he wanted to write. He died in Italy. He'd gone there because the doctors thought that the warm weather might extend his life a little bit. His final wish was that his grave should bear the words, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." That reflects the idea that he felt he just hadn't had the chance to live up to his potential. His life was too short to be remembered, and his poetry was like words written in water. But of course, he couldn't be more wrong. Sadly, when he died, he'd only had about 200 volumes of his poetry sold, but who knows what the figure is today. I mean, he's simply one of the most important English poets that ever wrote. La Belle Dame sans Merci was written towards the end of his life, after his brother Tom had died of tuberculosis, but before he found out that he was dying of the same disease. Here's a reading of it.
Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, so haggard and so woe-begone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest's done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses 4. And there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed, on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La Belle Dame sans Merci hath thee in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here, on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing.
La Belle Dame sans Merci is a ballad, which is a medieval genre revived at the time that Keats was writing. The Romantic poets were very keen on the ballad form. So Keats uses the so-called ballad stanza, which is a quatrain, in other words, a stanza 4 lines long, in alternating iambic, tetrameter and trimeter lines, meaning 4-beat and 3-beat lines, so short lines on a strong iambic rhythm, which is pleasing to the ear running through this poem. You've got to remember as well that ballads were designed to be passed on by word of mouth, so they needed to be easy to remember, and of course the strong rhythm and rhyme assists that process, as does the repetition, which there's a lot of in Keats's poem. So he uses a number of features that we expect to find in a classic ballad, such as very simple language, as I've mentioned, repetition, and an absence of details. Like in the old ballads, what he's doing here is telling a story in a really pared down, simple way. In terms of the structure of the narrative, that's quite straightforward really in this poem. What we have is an unidentified passerby stopping to ask a very sickly looking knight what's wrong with him. That happens in the first 3 stanzas, and then in the remaining stanzas the knight answers the question by talking about his love for a beautiful lady who's abandoned him, and now to all intents and purposes he seems to be dying of a broken heart. So that's the structure of the poem. The title of the poem is French and it translates into The Beautiful Lady Without Mercy. So we immediately have a very ominous tone established. We're going to be hearing about somebody beautiful but cruel and heartless, and we don't expect good things to be happening in this story. The foreboding tone is reinforced in the first stanza because we have described a really desolate, lonely landscape. The plants are withered and there's no bird song. The night as well is alone and palely loitering, and you'll find that that word pale is repeated throughout the poem many times. So this is a bleak tale from start to finish. Keats is evoking a colourless world, which perhaps is the way the world does appear when you're suffering from a broken heart, as the night is. The first person that we hear speak in the poem is the unnamed narrator, who's come across a knight that he's worried about. And the poem begins with a question. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, alone and palely loitering? So the speakers notice that something is clearly wrong with this knight. He's loitering by himself around the edge of a lake, and he's also pale. The speaker goes on to say that the sedge, in other words, the marsh plants, have all died out from around the lake, and that no birds sing. So we conclude that this is autumn or early winter. The birds have all migrated and plants are withering away. So this setting establishes a bleak tone, and obviously autumn is a season associated with endings, isn't it? It creates in itself a sense of loss. It becomes clear that the knight doesn't answer the passerby immediately, because the passerby has to repeat the question. Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, so haggard and so woebegone? The adjectives haggard and woebegone suggest that he's both emotionally and physically at a low ebb. Haggard suggests a worn-out, tired look, doesn't it? And woebegone, a sadness. The last 2 lines of the stanza do more to set up the scene, so now we hear about the squirrels that have finished filling up their granary, or storage of food for the winter, and the crops have been harvested. So we can safely say it's autumn. I see a lily on thy brow with anguish moist and fever dew. So the speaker continues to address this sick, depressed knight-at-arms, and he asks about the lily on the knight's brow, suggesting that the knight's face is pale, like a lily. And of course, a lily is also a flower we associate with funerals, isn't it? The knight's forehead is sweaty with anguish and with fever, so he's obviously very sick. And the last 2 lines of this stanza describe how the healthy colour is rapidly fading from the knight's face. He's evidently got some energy left though, some life left in him, because he does manage to answer the passerby's question, and at this point in the ballad we have a switch of point of view, and the knight now begins to tell his story, begins to answer the question. So he says, I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairest child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. So the knight's explaining that he met a beautiful, fairy-like lady in the meads, or fields, as we would call them. She evidently had long hair, she was graceful, and she had wild eyes. We're not sure what wild eyes would look like, but clearly the knight thought that they were attractive. He continues, I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. So, I don't think I need to suggest to listeners that that can be read on two levels. But let's start with the flowers first of all. So the knight made her a flower wreath or garland and flower bracelets as well. Also a fragrant zone, which is a belt made of flowers. We'll talk about all this floral imagery later, clearly very important in the poem. Lots of flowers mentioned already. We get the impression that the knight is simply decking her out in flowers. Fragrant zone, though, could also refer to an intimate part of the lady's body, couldn't it? And that would make sense given the final line of this stanza and the knight's reference to her making sweet moan. So there, a suggestion that the knight and the lady are having sex. Notice the break in the iambic rhythm as well. Made sweet moan. Each word in that phrase emphasised because it's a stressed syllable. So the knight, unconsciously perhaps, emphasising the ecstasy of that moment. The story continues with the next stanza. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy's song. So here the knight puts the lady on his horse, his pacing steed, to take a ride. Yes, again, sexual connotations, you might suggest. But the knight is so absorbed with his erotic encounter with this fairy lady that he doesn't notice anything else all day long. She leans sidelong towards him and sings fairy songs, and he's completely lost in that moment. He's bewitched. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. So the knight's here saying that the fairy lady found him tasty roots, honey, and manna to eat. Now manna is supposed to be food from heaven. You've probably heard the phrase manna from heaven. So this word makes the fairy lady seem supernatural, if not actually divine. She tells the knight that she loves him, but she says it in language strange, which is quite mysterious. The knight doesn't say what the language is, or how he's able to understand her if it's language strange. Maybe he's just hearing what he wants to hear, or maybe her magical influence has allowed him to understand her language strange. Whatever, there's something very mysterious going on at this point in the poem, and he's under some powerful but delightful spell. And in the next stanza the plot thickens. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses four. So the fairy lady takes the knight to her elfin grot. Elfin just means having to do with elves, as you'll know if you've read any Tolkien. And a grot is a grotto or cave. So once they're back at her fairy cave, she cries and sighs loudly. The knight doesn't say why she's crying, and we never find out. It's left to our imagination. The knight kisses her weepy eyes 4 times. Interesting, it's 4 times because we normally get the magical 3 in fairy tales, don't we? Kisses her 4 times. And again, her eyes are described as wild. In fact, that idea of wild eyes is emphasised through its repetition. Her wild, wild eyes. The knight continues, and there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed. Ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed, on the cold hill's side. So the fairylady lulls the knight to sleep, like a baby in her cave, and he starts to dream something. But as he remembers this dream, we get the dash in line 34, and he exclaims, "Oh, woe betide!" And it's clear that even the memory of this dream is so horrible that he can hardly recall it. It's ominous as well that the knight refers to this as the latest dream. In other words, the last he'll ever have. Recounting the dream, he says, "I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, 'La Belle dans Merci hath thee in thrall.'" So the men in the dream are all men of power and achievement, aren't they? They're kings, princes, warriors. But their paleness associates them with the loitering pale knight, who's the subject of this poem, and with death. In fact, we're told that they are death pale, these men processing past the knight in his dream. They cry out to him, "La Belle dans Merci." That's the first reference to the poem's title. So they're telling the knight that this beautiful lady is without mercy, and "hath thee in thrall" is a reference to this idea that she has the knight in bondage. He's captured, powerless against her seduction. The knight now continues to describe the pale warriors from his dream. He says, "I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here, on the cold hill's side." So all he can make out in the gloam, or the dusk, is the lips, the starved, hungry-looking lips of the pale warriors. Their mouths are all open as they cry out their warning to the knight. These cries from the beautiful lady's previous victims succeeded in rousing the knight from his stupor, his coma, his dreamlike state, whatever it was, and he found himself on the cold hill's side, which is where he is at the start of the poem, of course. And that is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. So the knight has finished his story. He tells the original unnamed speaker in the poem that this is why he's hanging out, in other words, loitering by himself, even though it's so awful outside, so dismal, so bleak. Notice that the poem ends the way it begins, with a description of this dismal setting. So we do get the impression that the knight is back with reality. He's in the real world again. But what we don't know is whether he's going to survive this experience, or really what decision he's come to, if he's come to any decision at all. So it's a mysterious end to a essentially very mysterious poem. Reduce this poem down to a single message and really you miss the whole point of it. It is supposed to be mysterious and open to interpretation, and it has been interpreted several different ways. Before thinking about an interpretation though, let's just recap the story. I think that would be helpful. So the poem begins with the speaker, a bypasser, coming across a knight at arms who's alone and looks like he's dying in a field somewhere. So the bypasser asks the knight what's been going on, and the knight's reply takes up the rest of the poem. In his reply, he says that he met a beautiful lady in the fields. They developed a relationship involving flowers and flirtation and possibly sex. She took him back to her fairy cave, and then things became dark and sinister because she lulled him to sleep. And in this sleep, he had a nightmare vision of knights and kings and princes that the woman had previously seduced and which were all now dead. Then he woke up alone on the side of a hill somewhere. You could read this as a poem about the dangers of obsession. If you think about it, the knight becomes so enraptured with the fairy lady that he forgets everything else. It says that explicitly in the poem. The whole world disappears. He thinks only of her. So her kisses put him into a coma. And that's how the speaker of the poem finds him at the beginning. So this is a poem about the danger of obsession, be it drug addiction, romantic or erotic obsession, you name it. Keats seemed to be suggesting that the fate of his knight at arms could happen to any of us at any time, if, that is, we neglect all of our responsibilities in order to feed some kind of an obsession. Keats doesn't seem to have anything very positive to say about women in this ballad, does he? When you think about the fairy lady, what does she do? She enslaves the knight and then ditches him, leaving him to mope around the lake looking haggard and pale. And this isn't the first time she's done this, let's remember. According to the knight's dream, there's a whole series of pale kings, princes and warriors whom she's ensnared in the past, before the knight came along. But of course we must remember that this is a story told from the point of view of the knight and not of the lady, so it's possible that we're getting a biased version of events. We must also ask whether this lady was actually real. Keats describes her wild eyes, and the knight refers to her as a fairy child. She appears out of nowhere. She apparently lives in an elfin grot in the woods. She can ensnare any man she meets with her beauty, her fairy song and her language strange. So she appears to be casting a spell over them. Or are they just too easily obsessed with whatever beautiful woman is in their immediate line of sight? Whether she's real or not, this beautiful lady, clearly this is a poem about love, about infatuation and becoming completely obsessed by one person and the dangers that lurk in that kind of obsession. Keats is also describing abandonment, the pain of abandonment, the whole world losing its colour, this idea of pale, pale, repeated, the coldness of the world, its desolation. That reflects how it is to feel abandoned by a loved one. The knight in the poem is abandoned without pity, and his solitude becomes the framing image of the poem. We begin with it, we end with the knight again palely loitering in that desolate, empty landscape. Some readers have suggested that the poem reflects Keats's own bitter experience with love. He resented the pain of it, and that's clear from his letters and some of his poems. And we know that he did experience real pain as well as pleasures when in love. He resented as well the loss of freedom that comes with falling in love. So the poem certainly expresses some of those feelings, as well as telling a really good story, which is traditionally all that the ballad is supposed to do. We've already established that this ballad is written in the form of a dialogue between two people, two speakers. The first speaker is anonymous. We know that this is a passerby who comes across a very poorly looking knight and inquires as to his health and fortune, but we don't know who the bypasser is. We don't even know whether this individual is male or female. He does, however, give us a lot of information about the knight and the setting that he finds the knight in, and it's, of course, the knight's voice that we hear for the rest of the poem.